Hey everybody, it's Brent Lee from Lads on Tour. We just wanted to let you know that we had a few technical difficulties on this Twitter space. Well, should I say I had some difficulties after a few minutes and couldn't reconnect for the rest of the episode. But Stars of Sea and Dr. Ivor Mac PhD continued the show with Annie Kelly like champs. Unfortunately, we have decided to cancel our monthly Twitter spaces. But we will be continuing this podcast, and it's going to be bigger and better than any of our previous tours. So make sure you're subbed or following us on your chosen podcast app. Enjoy the show. Yo, it's the Lads on Tour with Stars, Ivor and Brent Lee, dispelling myths being told through the centuries. Live on your Twitter space, switch off your telly. We about to have a chat with Dr. Annie Kelly. Yeah, you may know her from a very old podcast, VaccineAHumanStory, all about the smallpox vax.
Yes.
On top of that, she making British people cool again when she ain't depressing Jake, Rock, and Julian.
Really nice.
Wow.
First time I've ever been introduced by a rap.
It's the first time we've ever introduced anybody with a rap. Wow.
Oh, what? So not every guest gets this treatment?
No, typically
Nice.
I just sing Lads on Tour theme tune here and then we start.
Yeah, okay, so good evening, everybody. We are here today, Lads on Tour, episode 6, with Dr. Annie Kelly. I'm Brent Lee, and my co-hosts today are Stars of COVID.
Hello.
And Ivor Mecton.
Oh, hey.
Well, Annie, we've been looking forward to speaking to you for quite some time. Would you mind introducing yourself to everybody?
Yeah, no problem. So my name's Annie Kelly. I'm the British correspondent on the QAnon Anonymous podcast, and I'm also a researcher on anti-feminism, the far right, and digital conspiracy theories as well.
Excellent. So what got you interested in this mad world of conspiracies?
I think I've always been quite interested by, I guess, quite extremist spaces online. My PhD was on digital anti-feminism, which at the time, around sort of 2016 or so, was kind of emerging into what would later be called the alt-right. I suppose I've always been interested in people that see the world very differently from me and sort of trying to find things in common. So like politically, I'm very kind of left-wing and very feminist, but I think I do have some things in common with kind of conspiracy theorists and kind of extremists of all stripes, which is that, you know, I have a real sense of dissatisfaction about the state of the world and our society, but we obviously approach that dissatisfaction in very different ways. And so I think conspiracy theories are so present in extremist spaces that it's just kind of impossible to not come across them and then become interested in what their role is, what they're doing for those groups.
Yeah, both sides, I guess, they have a very populist message.
Yes, exactly.
Is it always linked with extremism? Well, should I say, is conspiracism always linked with extremism, or is extremism more likely linked with conspiracism?
No, I mean, I think because the word conspiracy theory can be kind of stigmatizing, I think, in fact, conspiracy theories are really common. They're a really, shall we say, normal way of understanding the world when you have two pieces of information, both of which you believe to be true, but which don't quite fit together. Often the way I think that people will try and square that circle to make those two pieces of information fit together will be to come up with a conspiracy theory to say, well, there's something happening behind the scenes that makes these two things look like they don't fit together, but they actually do. And I think almost everybody does this, including, very moderate centrist people, because it's just our way of kind of fitting the world together and understanding it. But I think a lot of the times when it's from a very centrist, moderate position, it doesn't actually get called a conspiracy theory. It just becomes an accepted explanation for the world, if that makes sense.
We've lost Brent.
Oh, no.
Oh, dear. Let me see. I think the best thing might be, Ivor, you probably have some stuff for Annie, and that'll give us a little bit of space for Brent to get back in.
All right, yeah. So I was obviously on incel duty, as it were. Yeah. So
tough work, but someone's got to do it.
Yeah, because it sort of seemed to spring up mostly in 2014, didn't it? With the sort of Gamergate thing. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I was actually aware of incels for a little bit longer, and I had the quite chilling experience, I guess, of hearing in the news about the first ever incel mass shooting, which was Elliot Rodger. And having been aware already of the forum that he came from, I believe it was called Pickup Artist Hate. I might have that wrong. But there were certainly some early kind of incel forums around that time. So 2014 was, I think, quite a pivotal moment for lots of those anti-feminist and anti-women kind of communities, because it was an opportunity for them, with things like Gamergate, but other kind of hashtag campaigns as well, to go from these quite separate forums and blogs and things like that, where they would obviously move from one to another, but there was very little networking there. But around 2014, they began essentially realizing the power that being on something like social media has in terms of networking you, in terms of kind of providing momentum. And I think this is what happens when they moved to YouTube first and then Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. The movement essentially became much more coherent. They became much better networked. And this is, when they, I guess, become a real force in terms of harassing lots of journalists and stuff like that, which is when they start to get public attention, essentially.
You had quite a lot of big YouTube creators got started, like Sargon of Akkad. He was one of the massive ones. A little bit cringy. I did used to watch a lot of his early stuff.
Yeah. Wasn't he originally like a history YouTuber? And then I think he realized that making videos about Anita Sarkeesian got him just like thousands more views. So I think there were a few YouTubers like that where they were clearly trying to get their YouTube business off the ground, and they sort of realized that this was just a really easy avenue for clicks, essentially, and they just full-scale pivoted to anti-feminism and then eventually just far-right politics.
Yeah,
kind of following the audience, I suppose.
Yeah, you sort of had, it started in 2014, you had those, and then it eventually kind of went to the more alt-right stuff.
Yes.
If you catch it with a lot of those creators today, like, it was Computing Forever, he was another one.
Did he become a COVID crank, or did I make that up?
He probably did. The overlap between these things is just stunning, isn't it? Yeah, I haven't seen him for a while, to be fair. But yeah, it's sort of like there's all this interlacing of all these different movements. In a large way, it is sort of like a conspiracy of women in that sense, isn't it? The sort of incel stuff, they're secretly controlling the world. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think conspiracy theories are really common for lots and lots of bigoted ideologies, because essentially they have to square the circle of why this group in particular, so be it women, or it could be Black people or trans people, or whichever group you have a particular animus against. You have to square the circle of why, if they're so inferior and stupid and weak and fragile, that you also believe they have so much power over you. Because in order to gain that, it doesn't sound like somebody who's very weak and stupid. And I think this is where the conspiracy theory comes in, because it's, as I said before, it's about matching two pieces of information that don't seem to fit. But if you say, well, they had help, from the outside, perhaps it was, these kind of powerful elites that helped them. Or, if you're a neo-Nazi, you'll probably say, well, it was the Jews that helped them. All of these kind of different conspiracy theories on why this group that's so inferior to you has essentially, in your imagination, got the upper hand. So I think conspiracy theories are almost necessary part of that ideology.
It's a key part of fascism as well. The enemy has to be weak, but also very strong at the same time. In terms of like terrorism and mass shooting side, has that like sort of increased as time's gone on, or?
Well, it's hard to define, I guess, because so many of these mass shooters that you come across, it's very rare that they actually belong to just kind of one of these ideologies, and then it can be quite difficult to pass their kind of anti-feminism from their white supremacy to their Christian identity, stuff like that. So it does certainly feel, I think, that if we bundle all of that up into far-right ideology, then yes, objectively, attacks are increasing.
Yeah, unfortunately.
So, yeah, let's talk about QAnon Anonymous then. It's a podcast I really enjoy. I don't think that they're ever laughing at conspiracy theorists. They're never laughing at the victims of Q, but some of the situations that they get into, some of the scripts are just so funny. How did you get involved with QAA?
Well, I think this is where probably the one case in my life where being addicted to Twitter has actually been really good for my career. Because I actually hadn't heard of the podcast, but I'd developed a little bit of a Twitter following. I guess I'm tweeting about my research, and I suppose at this point they put out a post saying they were looking for a UK correspondent, and I guess a few of my followers who listened to the podcast were just like, "Oh, talk to Annie Kelly." So they got in touch, and yeah, I think this was probably, about 2019, late 2019. And from then on, I just was their UK correspondent.
So Q's a weird conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
Can you summarize?
Oh, God.
Can you summarize Q in 1,000 words or less? No, can you summarize what Q is in, I don't know, a couple of sentences?
Yeah. So I guess I'll give the very core of QAnon. Because since the conspiracy theory started, it's actually got offshoots and different interpretations and different communities around it. But I guess I would say at its very core, or what it began as, was an anonymous poster on 4chan, who I think called themselves Q Clearance Patriot, who said they were working at very high-level security services in the Trump administration, and that Trump was engaging in a covert battle with the deep state, which was going to result, I think they at first promised the arrest of Hillary Clinton, but then they started spilling out into more and more high-profile arrests in the Democratic Party.
But her emails.
And also just anyone that Trump fans don't like as well. So this kind of spilled out into Hollywood actors and stuff eventually. But yes, I suppose the very core part of it is Donald Trump is engaging in a secret battle with the deep state, which is going to mean that all of you the kind of MAGA fans, enemies, will be publicly punished and humiliated and possibly hung for treason as well.
Well, that doesn't sound like a barrel of laughs. So I know we spoke a little tiny bit about this before Stephen, but how does Q differ from another conspiracy theory? So how does it differ from, let's say, the 9/11 conspiracy theories and the jet fuel can't melt steel beams and all that? What, if anything, is different about Q and how it's structured and how it's put together?
I guess the thing that is different from what you might call more classic conspiracy theories with QAnon is that it doesn't just claim to interpret one event that happened in the past. And so if you think about the big events that have sparked conspiracy theories, it's things like the JFK assassination or 9/11. But these are all based around this one specific event in history, which people think they can unpack. I think what's slightly different about QAnon in that regard is it claims to interpret almost all events as they unfold. So it's kind of like a rolling conspiracy theory in that sense. It doesn't just stay on one thing that happened. It promises that you can, through the lens of QAnon, you can actually interpret almost anything that's happening around you.
You can see why that's attractive in a world that's confusing.
I think it's very seductive. I think especially in the kind of internet age, right, where you are just barraged with so much information, and it can be very tiring and wearying to sort of work out each kind of little bits of information that comes to you. What's its bias? Is this the whole truth? What angle am I getting here? I definitely got that sense watching QAnon Telegram chats as they discussed the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It seemed so easy and simple for them because they could just interpret it through the Q canon and say, well, Putin is actually a good guy who's invading because he wants to destroy the COVID biolabs that are there in Ukraine. It was quite a seductive way of reading the world, even if it's completely wrong, because it's just so easy, do you know?
Yeah, I guess because it's so all-encompassing,
yes,
then
exactly.
you have an answer for everything. I mean, to be fair, we probably fit every event into whatever worldviews or understanding of the world or understanding of the movers and shakers. We probably fit everything into our existing worldview.
Yes.
It's not a real phrase. I'm probably extremely NATO-pilled. So whenever I heard about this, I was like, well, really, we should have tried to get Ukraine to join NATO earlier, and then Putin wouldn't be at this because he knows what he would get. I think we always try and fit stuff in, but yeah, because Q's it's like a massive ball of mud.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote an article recently. As I mentioned before, it all started with this poster on 4chan and later 8chan called Q. But Q stopped posting roughly a little bit after the 2020 election. And since then, I do think something has changed in the conspiracy community, where I feel like there's less emphasis now on saying what is happening, giving, kind of not just a positive version of events, but a kind of active explanation for things. And it more seems to be now about what's not happening. So what I mean is there's no longer any kind of coherent core that they can staple this to. It's more just about saying, no, the war in Ukraine isn't happening. No, COVID isn't happening. One example, which I thought was really funny, was the slap at the Oscars was fake. It's almost like it's just kind of constantly denying everything that you see in front of you. And people will have different explanations for, why that is. But it almost seems to have, without that guiding document of the Q drops, it seems to have kind of devolved into, just straightforward denial on almost everything.
That's fantastic with the Oscars slap. I mean, who cares?
I know, yeah. I know, and it's so schizophrenic when you're in these kind of chats as well, because it's just moving from one to the other. War in Ukraine, slap. They're all given this kind of equal layer of importance because it's all about showing, a flaw, a mistake that the kind of cabal have made in putting on this bit of theatre.
Because the best claim I heard about the slap was, because originally the joke was about Will Smith's wife having alopecia.
Yeah.
And they were on about how Pfizer's just going into clinical trials with a drug for alopecia.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah, they were saying it was all an ad for Pfizer's alopecia drug.
It's dumb. If you have alopecia, you're going to know about it. And if you don't, you're not going to be looking for the drugs. It's so dumb. How do they cope with, obviously, by now you would have expected, according to what Q folk were saying in 2020, you would have expected the storm or the whatever to have happened by now, and Hillary Clinton should be in jail, and Trump should be president alongside the bloated corpse of JFK and what have you. How do they cope with that stuff not happening?
One thing to remember is that, the very, very first ever Q drop started with a failed prophecy. It said that Hillary Clinton would be arrested that weekend, and she obviously wasn't. It's almost baked into the design of it, actually, that they're so used to false prophecies. But there's always an interpretation. There's always a way that you can say it was never proven wrong at all. Some people said that Hillary Clinton, in fact, had been arrested and it was a body double that was walking around now. And you could tell because the earlobes weren't the same. There's always a reason you can come up with. And I think something quite similar happened with Q. Some people kept on insisting, no, the storm has happened. This isn't the real Joe Biden. Some people, said the storm was meant to happen, but it's been betrayed. Some people just, reset their clocks and just said, oh, the storm will happen in the 2024 election. I think everyone who watches these spaces with a critical eye was hoping that there would be some kind of mass dawning, there's some mass realization that this had all been a hoax. But in fact, I think the opposite may have happened. I think since Donald Trump left office, more people say they believe in QAnon than before.
Isn't that interesting? I mean, there's definitely parallels with the anti-vaxxer community and, the various things that were supposed to happen to vaccinated people. Well, I say it was supposed to happen, things that were predicted by such leading lights of immunology as Pooh Lady.
The idea, yeah.
Yeah, and all that stuff hasn't happened, and they have also got more and more extreme. We interviewed Graham Botley, the immunologist, and we were going through all the various nonsenses. Whenever we got onto that one, I couldn't even say it out loud without giggling. It's so stupid. Well, I guess we'll leave the QAnon Anonymous podcast to one side. And by the way, everyone should subscribe to it. It's like, imagine this show, but well produced and funny. I mean, that's and about a different subject. And we'll go on to something else which is much better produced than our show, which is Vaccine a Human Story. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your podcast, Vaccine a Human Story?
Yeah, so very briefly, Vaccine the Human Story is the story, I guess, of the development of the smallpox vaccine and also the first ever anti-vax movement, because even though it's a history podcast, I can't resist those people whatever point in history they're at.
Smallpox was obviously the first thing we called vaccine, really, was that. So what was unique about smallpox? Why was smallpox the big prize?
Well, yeah, you're quite right. It's the first vaccine, and it's actually where we get the word vaccine from, because it's vacca, which I think is the Latin for cow, and cowpox was used for the vaccine, but that vaccine specifically, but we've just borrowed the word. I guess it was also the first disease ever to be deliberately eliminated from humankind. But I think also when I started researching it, I kind of had no real idea of how much salience it had for pretty much all of human life, pretty much all of human history before us. Smallpox would have been so much of a bigger part of their lives than we can really imagine now. And I think that really grabbed me.
You know, you talked about parents being told, don't count your children until they've had smallpox and survived it.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
Unimaginable to us. Where, I mean, thankfully, I mean, I know people who've had miscarriages. I don't even think I know anybody who's had a child who's died young. I mean, I'm grateful for that. Obviously, smallpox has been around, as you say, for an extremely long time. How do people attempt to treat it, to deal with it before inoculation and vaccination? And what did they think was happening? What were some of the ideas that people had about smallpox? You know, obviously, we're not asking this to be critical. People who didn't have the tools to know what was going on and took a punt, if you like.
No, I'm not going to be like those idiots from history.
No. C.S. Lewis talks about chronological snobbery, and I think he has a point.
So I think the most common early interpretation that we can find of smallpox, which you're so right, makes complete sense from their perspective, is that it is a demon or a deity of some kind that could be appeased almost with offerings and prayers. And what's interesting about looking back on this is this kind of religious aspect, what we might call kind of religious ritual, actually often includes what we also now recognize as early medical treatments. So, for instance, there's an early ritual in India which involves cooling the patient's skin with wet cloths, which we still do now when someone's got a fever to help ease the fever. One thing, I guess, that is also very hard for us to imagine is that in lots of built-up areas in Asia and Europe, smallpox is endemic, meaning everybody who can get it has had it, apart from the daily supply of children that are being born into this population, which means that smallpox keeps on running through the population, but it's only children that get it because everybody else is already immune. And so a lot of the early understandings, scientific understandings of smallpox start from this. They conceive of it as a children's disease. There's a Persian scholar called Al-Razi who conceives of it basically as a human stage of development, a bit like puberty. That as the blood matures, or a bit like grapes fermenting into wine, I think he describes it, then you get smallpox, sometimes just as a byproduct of this blood maturing. And later this theory develops in Europe into thinking that smallpox was the result of the blood running too hot in the body and needing to be cooled. And this caused different kinds of treatment. There's one where, obviously, if your blood's running too hot, people just assume you need to be cooled down. So they'll say you need to be in a room with open windows, no fire. But there's another one which I really like, actually, which is called the red treatment. You could speed up the process of the blood heating, essentially kind of fast track your way through the whole smallpox process. And so they would try and wrap the patient up in red blankets and place them by an open fire. And ideally, they'd say, place them in a room which is all painted red, because the idea was that this would kind of heat up your blood, get it as hot as it possibly could, and then it would start coming down again. And red actually does seem to be a common association with smallpox just in general, I guess because the sores themselves are very kind of red and inflamed. It was often said that in cultures that conceived of smallpox as a demon, that the demon would be afraid of the colour red. So yeah, this is a kind of common theme.
Thank you. I think it is very easy to laugh at people who are doing their best with the information that they've got available to them. But I think that it's interesting to hear some of those things in the absence of of information that we would have about germs and so on. You can understand why you've got to try and work something out. I actually think that this stage, like puberty, is probably the one that I would have the most sympathy with. I think it's not a bad theory in the absence of germ theory. So let's talk about smallpox in the New World. So you talked a little bit about smallpox in a society where it's endemic and basically everybody gets it as a child.
Yeah.
And about a third die, right? And then 2/3 are immune for life. But that wasn't the case in North America amongst Native American tribes.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're exactly right. Yeah, European settlers essentially in the New World have a huge advantage in that most of them are immune to smallpox when they come over, but smallpox has just basically never been seen before on this continent. And the effect of this disease kind of running through these populations, which essentially have no inbuilt immunity, is just kind of catastrophic. There's stories of, I think, when the Spanish come to South America, they're taking through a very small army with the hope of colonizing the area. And they're met with almost no resistance because the disease has actually preceded them through these communities and just laid waste to so many of them. So this is, an accidental kind of byproduct of colonial approach. But the incident that you're talking about, the Fort Pitt siege, is possibly the only recorded instance, which isn't to say it's the only instance, of colonial forces essentially trying to use smallpox as biological warfare deliberately. And what happens is the British are being sieged in a military fort called Fort Pitt, which I think is now in modern-day Pittsburgh. They're being besieged by the Ottawa Indigenous tribe, and the siege lasts for a really, really long time. And when sieges at this time happen, there would usually be kind of settlements outside, and everyone would crowd inside the military fort. All of the settlers would crowd inside. It's really crowded inside the fort, and people start getting sick, and people start getting smallpox. We have a letter writing to a colonel outside of the fort saying, people are getting sick, and we really don't know how much longer we're going to last. The colonel, who is in Philadelphia, suggests that they contrive, and this is his words, to reduce the disaffected tribes. But what's strange is that actually before that letter even has a chance of reaching them, we have a diary entry from a merchant inside the fort who says that there were peace talks with some representatives of the Ottawa tribe, and says they gave them 2 blankets and a handkerchief from smallpox patients. Then he says quite sinisterly, I hope they have the desired effect. Now, we don't actually know if it did. Like COVID, we do now know that smallpox main transmission vector is from person to person, not material to person. So we don't know whether it worked. But it is basically a glimpse inside the kind of mind, essentially, of the kind of British colonial soldiers, which is that they were perfectly willing to use this advantage they had of immunity over the people they were colonizing.
It was shocking to hear of that. Now, this next episode was the episode we talked about inoculation in China, and I think in India as well. I was really astonished by this. Can you talk us through the inoculation process that was happening in cultures outside of Europe that you talked about? This is before vaccination.
So, I'm glad that, it was of interest to you, because it was certainly not something I had ever heard about either, which is that there was a process very similar to vaccination that actually existed for hundreds of years outside of Europe. And this was called inoculation. I know we sort of use those words, vaccination and inoculation, interchangeably now, but inoculation in this context means something different, which is when you use some smallpox. It was usually scabs from an infected patient, and you use them essentially either by creating a cut and inserting it into the patient's arm. In some really gnarly cases, people would snort them. But you essentially use them to induce a mild case of smallpox, hopefully, in the patient, to create immunity, to basically kickstart that immunity. I think the very earliest recorded mention we have is from China from 1549. So that's more than 200 years before Jenner invents the cowpox vaccine. And we think it's most likely to have spread out from there to India possibly it was just invented in Africa around the same time and parts of the Middle East. And what's really interesting about this, I think, is that European visitors to all of these countries noticed that people were practicing inoculation. But because of a lot of it was wrapped up in religious ritual, a bit like I was talking about before, where lots of medicine has religious aspects to it in kind of earlier cultures, they just kind of dismissed it as like witch doctoring, just a superstitious practice that didn't really merit any kind of attention or investigation. There were a couple of British doctors, to their credit, who did try to bring up the practice back home, but they're just kind of largely dismissed as eccentrics.
It definitely does feel like Europe missed an opportunity to put smallpox under pressure earlier.
Yes, definitely.
Right, we'll go back to the actual content in a second too, but I want to ask about the production value and the quality of what you've done on that podcast, Annie, is extraordinary.
Thank you.
It really is.
Thank you. I wish I could take all of the credit. We were produced by Paul Cooper from Fall of Civilizations, who did a lot of the work of making it sound and look as amazing as it does. I wish I could.
So what's the process? And you record this stuff at home or in a studio or whatever, and you send him over the recordings, and something with a beautiful soundscape pops out the other end of his process.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, I just recorded, in the very room I'm sitting right now. And I don't know if you've ever listened to Fall of Civilizations podcast, but it's...
I haven't. I'll add it to my list.
Yeah, it's quite a similar experience, I think, of what I kind of wanted to do, which was to try and get people to think as close as possible that they are in that situation, they are in that time. So I wanted kind of, soundscapes and voice actors and that sort of thing. That was all, either done together or by him. But Fall of Civilizations does a really similar thing, although it's a lot longer than Vaccine. That was one thing I insisted on, that they not be longer than 40 minutes, because I have a very short attention span when it comes to podcasts, and I can't really listen for that long.
Well, 45 minutes into this, that's...
Oh no, it's fine. When I'm talking, it's fine.
So we get to Jenner's vaccination, and this is brilliant. This is another step forward against smallpox, but it's a controversial step. So let's talk a little bit about what he did, and then what was the immediate opposition or how people reacted to it.
The story goes that Dr. Jenner is just minding his own business, being a country doctor in Gloucester, when he hears a milkmaid say to her friend that she's not afraid of catching smallpox because she's already had cowpox, which was a disease mainly of cows, but which people could get from being in very close proximity with them. And it's much, much more mild. Nobody's ever died of cowpox. And largely what it looks like is on your hands, just a little rash that then goes away. Now, what is interesting is in the connection to inoculation. So the Europeans have finally caught on, essentially, to 200 years after everyone else, to inoculation being a really useful way to provide immunity for smallpox. So inoculation is now a normal practice in England. And what is probably most likely is that people wouldn't have noticed they were immune to smallpox without mass inoculation happening all around the country. So he's kind of developing on the findings from that theory. But he needs, obviously, to test the theory itself, because right now all it is just a bit of folk wisdom. And to experiment, what he needs is a subject that had never caught cowpox or smallpox, either the natural way or from being inoculated. And he turns out to find such a subject in his gardener's son, James Phipps. So this is, I suppose, one of those slightly murky questions of history, because he obviously does experiment on Phipps. He takes material from cowpox, which are on the hand of a milkmaid. He then vaccinates Phipps with it. And then later he inoculates Phipps with smallpox and finds that it has no effect. So he finds that he has created immunity for smallpox with cowpox. It's a little bit of a grey area, I think, because although it certainly fitted the medical ethics of its time, I do sometimes think we would probably think a little bit differently about that experiment if it had not succeeded.
Yes.
If it had failed in some way, then, people will often say, well, this was, just how things were done back then. And that's true, but I definitely think, it's something when you're doing research on medical history that you have to just get really, really used to, is a lot of people just writing down, I wasn't sure if this would work, so I just tried it on the local orphan,
Whenever you put it like that, it sounds bad.
Yeah, but I mean, one thing I should say is that actually James Phipps and Edward Jenner do have a friendship for the rest of their life. And in fact, I think Edward Jenner essentially pays for James Phipps to retire. He pays him kind of a salary after he's too old, and they seem to have a kind of constant correspondence. So even if we may say it's a bit iffy, they did seem to remain good friends, and James Phipps bore no ill will. But yeah, you talked about the oppositions, almost immediately opposition, essentially, to Jenner's discovery, which is actually from doctors, because by now, as I said, inoculation is very popular, and inoculators viewed Jenner as a threat to their business, essentially. So some of the first ever anti-vax activists were themselves doctors who were saying, this new process is dangerous, we're not sure if it works, why don't you just stick to good old-fashioned inoculation?
Yeah, because I guess inoculation actually, we knew that did work.
Mm.
In your view, is there something about vaccination that makes opposition more likely? So I've never heard about a mass antibiotic movement, for example.
That would be anti-antibiotic.
Yeah, I guess homeopathy is pretty close to that because it's pretty much anti-medicine that works in some forms. But is there something about vaccination in particular that makes people more likely to oppose it than any other medical tool?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, one thing is that whenever there's any medical development, there sometimes is opposition. But I think you are right that vaccination has a particularly violent, a particularly populist one that you don't get for things like antibiotics. I think there's something about vaccination being perceived as invasive and maybe even violent, and especially back then, actually, because nowadays vaccination is just a needle, and although a lot of people are afraid of needles, it was much more brutal back then. It would literally involve a doctor cutting with a lancet, a kind of cut through your arm, and then shoving matter in there. And this was, let's not forget, being done to newborn babies.
Like stuffing a turkey.
Yeah, so I think there's something about vaccination being done to children and babies that, I think in particular with all parents, they don't tend to like it. I remember my mum said that she cried when I was taken to have my first jabs as a baby. And, that's when she knew what vaccination was. She knew that it worked. You can kind of imagine how in Jenner's time, vaccination is only 10 or so years old. You can understand why parents have such a, I think, visceral response to it.
Yeah, I guess that with any other intervention, it happens once somebody is already sick. So it's obvious that something has to happen. Whereas with vaccination, it's something obviously we do in the hope that somebody doesn't get sick, or if they do, they'd get less sick than they would have done otherwise.
That's right. And I think, people's risk calculation is really interesting. So it's nearly always easier to do nothing, except for if you're really sick, where the risk calculation changes. But doing the risk calculation when you're not sick yet, but you might be one day, I think it's quite a difficult one to grasp.
I think that makes sense. So the government in the UK, well, probably in England, right, mandates vaccination against smallpox. But it sounds from your podcast that was probably a mistake.
Yeah, the English government went in very heavy-handed with vaccination. In 1853, when, it's, I think, just over 50 years old, they announced that parents who haven't vaccinated their children will be subject to a very steep fine. And then they actually expand those laws even further in 1867, saying that doctors, for the first time ever, had to register the birth of a new baby to the government so they could keep tabs better on who wasn't getting vaccinated. This was the first time when a family having a baby wouldn't be considered their own business, but the business of the government. Now, you have to remember that this is also a time when most of these people who are having to register their baby and then getting fined if it's not been vaccinated cannot vote for this government. They can't vote them in, they can't vote them out. People will kind of often complain these days about a surveillance state in 1984 and things like that when almost anything happens. But for these people, it was very literally a kind of imposed government who they had no say on. if you're very poor, your really only experience of them was kind of policing you, destroying your homes because they said they were slums, pushing you into the kind of workhouse, evicting you. There's nothing you can do about it. So now this government is saying you have to do this process, which, as I've said, feels very violent on your newborn baby. And they kind of respond, I think, as is quite an understandable way. They respond kind of violently. You know, there are riots in places like Leicester and Ipswich. They react incredibly aggressively. In fact, in as far as Leicester, you know, the local government in Leicester actually sends a petition to Parliament saying, please, please don't make us enforce these fines. They will kill us all. Like, it's just kind of really considered a step, not even a step too far, but, you know, it's considered just yet another imposition from a brutal, undemocratic government. I think it was a real mistake, essentially, what they did. Mandates, there's no doubt that they get results. If you want to see lots of people vaccinated very quickly, they do get results. But I think, you know, in this case, it needed, I guess, a kind of more sort of liberal approach, more education, more encouraging trust in the community, all these sorts of things that obviously a Victorian government had absolutely no interest in doing when it came to poor people. But yes, I think it backfired quite badly, and they lived with the results for almost 100 years.
So what worked in the end to actually boost uptake without causing the town halls getting burned down or what have you?
Funnily enough, it is those measures that I've kind of just described. It's education. You know, at the time that children start being sent more broadly to school, at the time that the government takes more time to explain what vaccination it is, I think also just as people have had enough time to get used to the concept of it, and they can see that it's not kind of killing people and things like that, people begin to get more comfortable with the idea and resistance largely decreases. But what I find so funny about this is something that Dr. Jenner, who the first inventor of the vaccine, just kind of intuitively understood. He kind of knew that people wouldn't necessarily trust him over somebody local they already knew. So after he develops the vaccine, he spends most of his life just writing letters teaching local doctors, not all of them doctors, just local people in the community, how to properly vaccinate people. And also, more importantly, how to encourage them to choose vaccination. He's very, very famous in his lifetime, but he doesn't become a traveling celebrity. He instead sets up a free vaccination clinic in his own home, writes letters training people how to vaccinate in their own communities. I think what he really wanted to do was ensure his invention's legacy. And I think he really, really believed it could change the world. But he also knew that in order to do that, it had to be accessible, it had to be free, and it had to be from people that the patient trusted.
Yeah, it was very regrettable whenever the CIA used a sort of piggybacked on the polio vaccination program to try and find bin Laden, because you can imagine the local people in the areas that they were targeting.
Yeah,
all of a sudden, they're told one thing, but something else happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's this kind of weird thing that, you know, any kind of trickery or coercion involving vaccines, but just public health measures eventually, you might get the results you want initially, but you pay for them eventually. Do you see? Yeah, it's like a debt. You essentially kind of leverage yourself, because it means that people will remember it the next time and they won't trust whatever you're pushing onto them 10 years down the line. I think for that reason, I definitely think that punishing people for not being vaccinated, there's no doubt that it works. You know, there's no doubt that it does boost up numbers, but it also means that 10 years down the line, hey, we've got a new vaccine that we want you to try. Unless you're very confident in those 10 years, you can win that trust back, which I think is increasingly hard for governments in the information age. It's a really risky bet.
Yeah.
Could I ask a quick question here?
Of course.
Yeah.
I wanted to sort of know, because today we've got, with the anti-vaxxers, you've got like these multi-millionaire grifters like Del Bigtree, RFK Jr. Was there any like multi-millionaire, well, obviously inflation, it won't be millionaires, but like that sort of a celebrity anti-vaxxer sort of role?
Yeah, there are. And there's actually a really funny example of one getting caught out in Canada. I forget which city, but essentially Canada, their anti-vax movement works much the same way. There's kind of, you know, there's a middle to upper class sector, which says, well, it's all about liberty and my individual rights. And there's a poorer section, which I think are kind of responding to a kind of imposition from a government that they have no say over. But there's one who is, he goes and gives speeches, he writes pamphlets, and the situation becomes so bad that Canada actually introduces vaccine passes, where if you've been smallpox vaccinated, you can go on a certain tram. And if not, then you have to go on the unvaccinated tram. And there's a newspaper article from the time where this figure of the anti-vaccine movement in Canada is caught on a vaccinated tram. So even while he was making money doing speeches saying how terrible vaccination was, he himself was vaccinated, which I think is quite a funny story.
RFK Jr. went to a party with vaccine passports. History repeats itself.
It is. That's all I thought. I thought of, all these people on Fox News where we know the Fox building has a vaccine mandate for all its employees.
At least Del Bigtree's big bum blood adventure shows, I guess, integrity in some way. We'll go on to the very end of the smallpox stuff. So we're on the Indian border now, and India is more or less rid of it, but some of the countries around it still have some smallpox. So there's a strategy introduced around the border at the World Health Organization. Do you want to talk us through that?
The WHO's campaign to eradicate smallpox, they start off with, I think, 33. Don't quote me on that, I might have that wrong, but I think it's 33 final countries where smallpox still exists. And I think what's really interesting is that you have this very political story, which is the WHO trying to convince the governments of these various countries that it's worth their time to let them in, give them resources, give them staff to work within their borders. But they are also fighting against a disease which fundamentally does not care about borders. And I think India is a really perfect example because so many of its borders are really new, as in within the last 50 years. Some are from, kind of partition when the British left, some are from war. And so what happens when you have these kind of quite hastily riven borders that are relatively new is that people will travel across them the same way they always did, the same way their communities have been doing for hundreds of years before the border was ever there. And very often they're not using the official routes, which are expensive and a bit slow, but smuggling routes that were cheaper and, again, probably older than the borders themselves. And there's a really fascinating biography by one of the women who was working on the WHO campaign called Dr. Cornelia Davis, who's American. She's working in West Bengal, which is a really classic example of this. It's got 3 borders, Nepal, Bhutan, and Bangladesh, I believe. And she notices that by only vaccinating across the official crossing routes for these borders, they are essentially missing a huge amount of people who are just traveling secretively through organized crime. So she does something really, really brave, which I'm not sure I would personally have the courage to do. And she actually seeks out the smugglers to recruit them to help her vaccinate all of these unofficial travelers that are coming across too, because she understands that, it only takes one person with smallpox to go across that border and essentially all of their hard work could be undone. And amazingly, the smugglers agree to it. And they even, tell people working for them, you must make sure that everybody coming across gets vaccinated. I guess they're kind of making the calculation, essentially, that any one of their workers getting smallpox is just as bad for their business as it is for the WHO's.
Yeah, or their health.
Yeah. So it's a story I really like, I think, because it shows that, in order to get these amazing results, which are, for the first time in recorded history, no smallpox, you kind of have to be flexible. And you kind of have to work on the ground and not always in what you might call the kind of most legally perfect ways. Yeah, it shows a kind of real level of flexibility and ingenuity.
I mean, it feels sort of like almost the opposite of the the mandates and the very law and order way of doing it, where it's we'll do our best to get this stuff into arms.
Yes, exactly.
In any way. Oh, we've got one more question about smallpox, about the lack of smallpox, which we enjoy. Do you think there was a greater human achievement than getting rid of smallpox?
Yes, in a word. I think it's part of the reason I wanted to tell the story, especially when I was kind of seeing so much anti-vax sentiment online. And a lot of it seems sort of based in this kind of idea of vaccinations being this kind of very high-tech, very scientific, quite scary imposition from above, I guess I sort of wanted to tell a story which showed that vaccinations are, in effect, the reason that we are here and the reason we enjoy the lives that we do, where, as you say, we're not still worrying about, counting our children before they've had smallpox. But I guess I also wanted to show that it's not just a story, I think, of, genius scientists, of all of these kind of very high-level people working in laboratories that we can't understand, but it's, the story of kind of disease and of curing the disease is just something that humans, I think, have kind of fundamentally always concerned themselves with. It's a really moving story, I think, the whole WHO campaign eliminating smallpox, because, it's at the height of the Cold War when they passed the resolution, and it's, the US and the USSR are both lending material support to this solution. Which from just a kind of very sort of hippy-dippy peace and love perspective seems lovely. And you will get, I've spoken to lots of academics in this field, and they will sort of try and black pill me a little bit and say, you have to understand that people weren't just doing this out of the kindness of their hearts. A vaccinated population is a productive population, and smallpox was just, bad for human productivity. And I think that's all true. But I do think it is kind of an amazing world that has been created out of that, where this disease, which I think probably humans suffered and died from, 1,500 years ago, at least, is just gone.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and obviously we've done incredible things. I say we as a species. I haven't personally done any of these. We've it's a place for human pride. Yeah, we've been to space, we've been to the moon, we've built the internet, we've discovered every landmass on this planet. We've done some pretty cool stuff. And you're very right about it being such a human achievement. The smallpox vaccine, if you compare it to the COVID vaccines, particularly the mRNA vaccines, which are so they're so based on technology and engineering and everything, which is fantastic. I'm a software engineer, right? So I'm not going to complain about that. That's all brilliant. Yeah. But the smallpox vaccine is so lo-fi. It's like, once again, if you haven't heard the podcast, get your podcast app, go looking for Vaccine the Human Story. It's 6 parts. It is so interesting to hear, so educational, and so beautifully produced. So unfortunately, Brent hasn't been able to come back in, but he does have one last question. And on that, we'll end the space and get out of here before it breaks again. If you can give any aspiring content creators and the rest of us one piece of advice dealing with the subject of misinformation or QAnon and so on, what would it be other than don't rely on Twitter Spaces?
Well, I think I probably don't need to tell you guys this, who are very kind of clued up on this, but it's something I think is always worth repeating because it's probably my pet peeve working in this space. But I guess when you're talking about people, even people who believe very bizarre things, is not to assume they're stupid or insane. For one thing, it's wrong. I think there's some quite compelling evidence, actually, that people who believe in conspiracy theories are possibly even smarter than your average person. But for another, a more important one, it doesn't help. It further polarizes people when you disrespect them like that. And I also just think in general, stupid people aren't where society is going wrong or where the harm is. I think there's kind of too much emphasis just in general on intelligence as the best thing that a person can be. Stupidity is the absolute worst thing you could be. When we actually see very intelligent people do really monstrous things, spread awful ideas all the time, there's more important things to be. So I think just as an insult and as a tactic, it just doesn't work. And I think a bit with the vaccine podcast, it was sort of something I really wanted to do, where I wanted it to be something that vaccine skeptical people could listen to and maybe feel persuaded by, but I didn't want to patronize them. I didn't want to say the history of vaccines has just always been perfect and wonderful. I wanted to kind of speak to the fact that there have been medical abuses and problems with vaccines just like anything else, but that overall I think it's a really positive humanitarian story. I hope I achieved that.
I mean, I think you did, because I can remember listening to it. I can remember where I was, and I can't exactly remember which part, but I remember this feeling of moving very quickly from frustration with the anti-vax movement to frustration, effectively, with the state. And I can remember where I was whenever I was out walking and listening to it in my headphones and heard that and realizing, whoa, hold on a second. There's a whole bunch of policy stuff. There's a whole bunch of trust stuff, and you can't just, not that I'd want to do this, but you can't just use raw state power to make it happen.
Yes, definitely. Well, I'm really pleased it had that effect, because that's what I wanted. I feel vindicated now. But yes, in essence, that would be my advice. Don't insult people. Don't talk down to them, I guess. But I don't think I need to tell you guys that.
So finally, are you convinced Joe Biden is staying young by drinking the adrenochrome or not?
No, I believe he was replaced with a clone sometime around the 2020 election. They may not have ironed out all the kinks. That's why he looks a bit younger.
Well, with that, we'll say, may the deep dish preserve you. Is that correct?
May the deep dish bless you and keep you.
That's the one. All right. Well, look, thank you so much, Annie. And
thank you so much for having me. It's been so much fun.
Bye.
Bye.